So today we're going to be discussing an analysis of Monopoly, the board game, as it relates to real-life economics or in the economic sense. Okay? So the first thing that I need to say is that when you start off playing the game Monopoly, it is not in fact a representation of a monopoly or a monopolistic industry. It is in fact a representation of an oligopolistic industry. And that reason why it is because there is no sole firm. If we refer to the players of the game as a firm within the industry of property ownership, then we have multiple firms competing within the industry. That is not a monopoly. In a monopolistic industry, there is one sole firm within said industry. The firm is the industry. And that is the goal of the game, is to become the sole monopoly, the sole firm of the industry. Okay? To make the other, to either buy out the other firms or to make the other firms go bankrupt. Okay? That is the goal of the game. So the goal is not, so the goal of the game is to form a monopoly. You do not start off as a member of a monopoly. You start off as a firm within an oligopoly. How is it an oligopoly and not a monopolistic competition? If you want to know the difference between the two, then you can go to my website. Link will be in the description. I update that regularly. Well, the difference is the fact that in an oligopoly there are barriers to entry. And although there is competition, there is still a lot of price setting. You're able to set the price. Now, in the game Monopoly, you're not able to set the price exactly, but you can once you have ownership over multiple properties of the same type, and all of the properties of the same type. Then you can put housing units, hotels, and things like that. That changes the price. You're setting prices outside of what the other firms have, right? So that is in fact a representation of that oligopolistic competition. Now, it's an oligopoly as well because there are many barriers to entry. First of all, there's a limited amount of players that can actually enter the game, as specified by the rules, but there's also a minimum number of players as specified by the game. You can't start off with one. You have to start off with at least 2 players in the game. Otherwise, there's no competition. Therefore, you in fact have to start off with an oligopoly and not a monopoly. Now, within said game, right, the current players in the game, the current firms in the industry, have the ability to stop or block entry into the industry by other new firms. If a new firm would like to join the industry, or in the realistic sense, a person would like to come and join the game of Monopoly, then the current players of the game have the ability to say no and block entry into the game. This is representation of the oligopoly blocking the entry of new firms into said industry. And an example of an oligopoly in the real world would be the network providers, AT&T, T-Mobile, Sprint, and Verizon, okay? Those are the 4 major competitors in said industry. There are more like Boost and Metro PCS, but we're not going to count those, and even if we do count those, it's still an oligopoly because there's barely any competitors, right? There are only 4 main ones, and the other ones are too small to even own enough of a sense of competition or profit to even make it into that respect. So, and then another one would be the global oil industry, which is mainly controlled by the OPEC countries, right? So that is how you start off as an oligopoly, and then over time, the game will end with the creation of a single firm within the industry, the establishment of monopoly. So now let's discuss some of the concepts of the game and how that relates to economics, and then we'll actually do some graphing as well to represent said game aspects. Now, when you start off as the oligopoly, each firm has the same loan or same amount of money, okay, to start off the game. Each one will have the same amount. You know, the 2 500s, 200s, 250s, 620s, or is it, yeah, 620s, 510s, 55s, and 51s. Okay? You have the same amount of money for each firm when the game starts. So you start off with the same amount. Now, as the game progresses, each firm will spend that money to buy properties. Now, this is the property ownership industry, so that is, of course, the difference. Now, in an oligopoly, you have product differentiation, and that also promotes competition between the firms in said oligopolistic industry. Now, what is product differentiation? Well, each firm in the oligopoly will want to have differentiation in their products from other competitors because in an oligopoly there's barely any competitors, but if you don't sell something unique to your own company, then that actually decreases the competition and decreases the likelihood of people buying your product. If you have more product differentiation, meaning that you have products that are unique to only your firm, then that makes it more likely for people to want to buy those products from your firm. Now, how does this relate to the board game Monopoly? Well, the differentiated products are the types or colors of properties that you can buy in said game. Now, when you achieve what is called a monopoly in the game, which is a rather confusing name for what we're discussing, so we're going to actually say that when you have all of the properties for a certain color in the game, that is the same thing as having ownership or a patent or some other sort of barrier to creation, like copyright, patent, and other things like that, for that type or color of property. Now, that means that no one else can buy that type or color of property. So if you have ownership over all three of the orange properties, that would mean that no one else can have ownership over an orange property because you have those properties and there are none left, right? So in that case, what that would mean is because you have those three orange properties, you have the ability to put housing units or hotels on those properties. Now, that means that because you have this unique product, you're able to change the price of said product because there are no competitors for that product, or in this case, for that property. So because there are no competitors for that, you can change the price however you want by changing the number of housing units or putting a hotel on said property. Now, what this means is that now you have product variation and differentiation between the firms, the competing firms. But you can also trade properties in the game. Now, what does that relate to in an oligopoly? Well, in an oligopoly, there is something called collusion of price, or just collusion in general. Now, what this means is that different companies or firms within the industry of an oligopoly have the ability to talk with one another and then collectively set price. They can all collectively raise the price so that you have to pay a higher price because there's no competing firms. They're all raising their price because there's so few firms within an oligopolistic industry. So in this case, right, what we have is having this trade between these two is the same thing as having that collusion, okay? In the real world, collusion is, in fact, illegal between companies. I think it's outlined in some of the trusts or some law, okay? But regardless, that is essentially what that is, right? Now, what is another aspect of monopoly that relates to oligopoly? Well, we've already discussed that product differentiation. Now, the same thing with product differentiation, right, is the fact that you have a limited amount of money that you can spend. So let's relate that to the concept of total cost, or of just cost, right, in the market. Now, each firm has a cost curve, meaning that they have to pay a certain amount in order to sell a product, right? Now, you can't just put housing units and hotels whenever you want, when you have that patent, right? When you have that ownership. You can't just put the hotel, or you can't just straight up just put a hotel on each one of those properties. No. You have to pay for it. And the reason why you have to pay for it is because there's a cost for what you do to the products. When you increase the output, right, the cost is going to change, okay? Right, so that relates to the cost curve for the firm. Now, what does the oligopoly look like as a graph? Well, in an oligopoly, each firm might have a different demand, or price curve for their firm. Now, if I were to draw the demand curve D1 for the first firm, and then this is the demand curve for the second firm, okay, what is going to be the collective demand curve? Well, in an oligopoly, there are so few firms, right? So the goal is to compete with your competitors. But since there are so few firms, it's easy to do price changing because oligopolies have the ability to do price changing, unlike monopolistic competition or perfectly competitive markets. Now, what this means is that oligopolists, right, the firms within an oligopoly, are going to want to sell at the lowest possible price. So they're going to ignore price increases of their rivals, and they're going to keep that same price. So I'll outline that in a different color. Let's do green. So they're going to ignore a price increase, right? So D1 is not going to set their price to what D2 has at this point, and we'll call this D2 has at this point, because they're actually going to be able to sell it at a lower price. But D1 actually has a higher price here, so D2 is going to ignore that higher price when they're selling, right? So they're going to want to sell at these prices. So now what does this mean? It means that the collective demand curve for both of them is going to be this green demand curve. That green line, as you can see there hopefully, this green line represents the kinked demand curve for the oligopolists, right? Because they're not going to want to sell at a higher price than their competitors. They're all going to want to sell at relatively the same price. And so that is the reason why you have this kinked demand curve. Now, in a monopoly, right, as the game continues, and many firms have to drop out of the market. Why? Because they lose money to the other firms. Because as time progresses, the firms are going to increase, right, are going to increase their product differentiation, the number of unique products that they have. So in the end, the companies, let's say that you start off, right, with 4 players, okay? If you start off with four firms in the industry, over time what's going to happen is that the invisible hand, meaning the dice, or the different chance or community chess things, or the different actions, taxes, and things like that that occur as you roll the die, or dice actually, because there's multiple. Those different events are going to cause the invisible hand theorem, remember that invisible hand theorem, is going to push, those resources, those economic principles, and all of those products and profits to, we'll say, 2 of those 4. The other 2 are going to have to declare bankruptcy. Now we have 2 competing oligopolists within the industry. And the goal, of course, is for one of those 2 to become the monopoly. Now, each one of those 2 have their own product variation. They have their own unique products, okay? So they're putting housing units, they're putting hotels on their properties. And what's happening is that as they put hotels and housing units, what's going to happen is that their demand is going to increase for both, right? But their supply is also going to the amount of money that they have is going to decrease over time, because it costs money to maintain those, to buy those housing units, to buy that hotel, right? It costs money. So because of that, what's going to happen is that you're reaching a certain cost limit, okay? Based on the amount of money that the firm has at said time, what's going to happen is that the invisible hand is going to keep on pushing to one of those, right? Now, the firm that comes out on top is going to become the monopoly, right? So, as the demand increases, essentially what's going to happen is that one of them is going to overtake the other because they have a better, they have more product variation, for one, might be a possibility. The other, they buy out, meaning, so let's say that the representation of having one of the firms land on your property is the same thing as buying a share in that firm, right? So if one of the competing firms lands on your property, then that means that that competing firm, you now own stock, has to pay you. You now own stock, essentially, is what we're going to refer to this. You now own a share in that firm. If that continues, if the firm does not have enough money to pay you if they land on your property and they have to pay you a large sum of money because housing units and hotels, then what's going to happen is that is a representation of buying out that firm. And when that happens, when the other competitor declares bankruptcy within the game, you obtain all of their money and all of their properties, of course at mortgage value, but you get all their stuff. That is a representation of merging, which also happens within oligopolistic competition. Now, because of that merging, essentially what happens over time is that each company will eventually declare bankruptcy to another company. And then the sole winner of the game will have every property and every piece of money that has been earned or bought in the game. What does this mean, right? It means that they have bought out every single other firm within the game. They have merged into a monopoly. But that monopoly now owns the entire industry. This is a really interesting concept, and we can relate it to Rockefeller, the Standard Oil Company. Because what happened was that Rockefeller would buy out the smaller competing industries, the smaller competing firms, and then they would merge into his, right? And he would own them, but they would be given a sum of money, of course. So it's sort of not like Monopoly where they have to pay you. You know, you have to pay to own stock in their company or to buy their company, essentially. But I digress. We'll just relate it to the way that I was describing beforehand. So what happens is that you go from having that oligopoly to having a monopoly. Now, what does a monopoly look like? Well, unlike a purely competitive market, what a monopoly curve looks like, okay, is that the marginal revenue is not equal to the price. Okay? It's not equal to the price. So you have the monopoly, and in a monopoly, there's only one graph. There's no industry. The industry is the monopoly. That one firm. There's one firm that controls the entire industry. So this is your demand curve or your price curve, right? But then this is your marginal revenue. Your marginal revenue is not equal to the price. This is because a monopoly is inefficient. So is a monopolistic competition, and so is an oligopoly. They're all inefficient because they're not selling, and I'll show you why. Because they're not efficient. And the reason why is because of price setting, price discrimination, and other things like that, right? So if I draw the marginal cost curve, this point at which marginal revenue meets marginal cost is going to be your profit maximizing quantity. We'll call that Q. But then the price is not equal to the marginal revenue. Because price is larger than the marginal revenue, you actually have dead weight loss right here. This is referred to as the socially optimal price. This is the point of socially optimal price and quantity. Okay? And then because this isn't here, this causes dead weight loss within the firm or industry. So this is actually the price. This point right here on the price curve is actually the profit maximizing price. And so this is the total. This box right here, formed by P and Q, is the total revenue of this firm. But we have dead weight loss because it's not allocatively efficient. It's not using all of its cost, right? It's not using all of its current resources to produce the most product. And so therefore we say it's not allocatively efficient. So because it's not selling at that socially optimal point, it is allocatively inefficient, which causes dead weight loss. Now if I draw the ATC curve, okay? If I draw the ATC, okay? When I draw the ATC curve, we actually have, in this case, we have economic loss because the price is, sorry, not economic loss. We actually have an economic profit because the price is higher than the cost, right? So we have an economic profit right here. So this is our profit. So that is the profit. Okay? But the fair return price is here. Now, why is this called fair return? Well, that's because that is the point of normal profit. Okay? That is the point where they break even, where the cost, the average total cost, right, is equal to the price at that quantity. Okay? Because at that point there is normal profit, a monopoly does not, in fact, this is the long run, right? A monopoly does not need, this is the long run, because no firms are going to join. This is the only firm within the industry. So therefore, the short run is the same thing as the long run. There's no such thing as really a long run in a monopoly. So a monopoly will always have profit or loss. And the only thing that can change that is the monopoly setting prices. Is the monopoly itself setting prices or changing what it's doing. So that is a discussion of how we can relate the Monopoly board game to concepts in economics. And I recommend that you actually do check out those links in the description for information about all of that stuff and graphing. But I hope this was a very intuitive video and that you actually learned some of the things that I discussed and you understood it, because that was the point of this video, was to relate the economic principles to something that hopefully most of you can understand. And with that, I'll end this video and I'll see you next time.